is going to be recorded and will be later uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. So I want to invite you to please keep your microphones muted during the talk. After the talk, we will have time for questions. So please feel free to use the hand raise function or type the word question in the chat box. Also, feel free to simply type out your question, and we will get to the questions in the order in which we receive them. And now it's time to introduce our esteemed speaker. Shulamit Magnus is Professor Emerita of Jewish Studies and History at Oberlin College, where she helped found and directed the program of Jewish Studies. Prior to Oberlin, she taught at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, the University of Pennsylvania, and Stanford University. She is the author of Jewish Emancipation in the German City, Cologne, 1798-1872, the two-volume unabridged translation and critical edition of Pauline Vengerov, Memoirs of a Grandmother, Scenes from the Cultural History of the Jews of Russia in the 19th Century, and A Woman's Life, Pauline Vengerov and Memoirs of a Grandmother, as well as scores of articles. She is the winner of a National Jewish Book Award and a Hadassah Brandeis Translation Award. As an activist on behalf of the right of Jewish women to full religious expression, she is a founder of Women's Group Prayer at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the Kotel, and a first-name plaintiff in a case before the Supreme Court of Israel for enforcement of Jewish women's already recognized right to read Torah at the Kotel. She's a frequent contributor of opinion and other pieces to Tablet, the Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, Moment, and the Forward. It is in her role as a social historian and activist that we are so delighted to welcome her today to the Graduate Center. Professor Magnus, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for the introduction and for inviting me to present to you today about my new book. As you mentioned, the book's title is Jewish Marital Captivity: The Past, Present, and End of a Historic Abuse. The title really says what the book does in three parts. The first part is history. Igun, that is Jewish marital captivity of women, is a problem created by halakha, rabbinic law, through the way that marriage is enacted. I will say more about that, but for now, I'll just say that there have been many treatments of igun as a halachic problem and endless go-rounds about this or that partial solution to it or explication of why it is ultimately unsolvable. That is not at all what I do in my book. Indeed, I argue that rehashing the quote-unquote tragedy of agunot, and I'm not saying that it's not a tragedy, I'm only referencing the original Greek understanding of the word tragedy as something that is determined and fixed and unavoidable, and igun, and the predicament of agunot is anything but predetermined and fixed and unavoidable. I say that the rehashing of the quote-unquote tragedy of agunot, women held in marriages against their will, of the supposedly intractable halachic problem of igun, which can be, in my terminology, managed but never ended, and of proposals that indeed manage the problem but don't end it, that all this is part of the problem, a circular and self-fulfilling discourse that serves to perpetuate igun. My book documents and dissects this approach as part of the problem and part of why igun persists, but it diverges fundamentally and emphatically from any such focus. My book is the first global social history of igun, the institution of Jewish women's marital captivity, and of agunot, women held in marriage against their will, from early medieval times to the present and across the Jewish world. That is, the Middle East and North Africa, medieval Ashkenaz and Sfarad, early modern and modern Europe, East, Central, and West, Italy and the Mediterranean, the United States, and Israel. It is the first work to attempt such a narrative across Jewish time and space, studying an enduring, if also evolving, social institution, and crucially, women's responses to it. I want to say something briefly about how historical inquiry is done. It has some basic methodology. First is chronology, being centered in real as opposed to mythical time, and dating significant events in their proper sequence. The history that I relate begins in the 7th century CE in what is present-day Iraq. Historical inquiry studies cause and effect in history and continuity and change over time. In short, it studies what happened, when, why, and how, and with what consequences. That is, the intersection of chronology, verifiable facts, evolving behavior, and cause and effect. Igun has been a fact of Jewish life from earliest recorded Jewish history to this day, but it has definitely had a moving history. That is, it was not a static reality, but one like any and all other social institutions, with development and change over time, change that sometimes benefited women and often didn't. A major question I ask in my book is why? Why did reforms that benefited women in marriage and divorce happen within traditional pre-modern patriarchal Jewish societies? What role did women play in those reforms happening? And when and why did such reforms cease to be enacted and change for the worse for women set in? I think you can readily hear the difference between this approach and that of halachists, whose interest is in law and legal dynamics, and often, in this case, apologetics, with women, agunot, being a static, disembodied, quote-unquote, problem for rabbinic study or jurisprudence. My approach in the book's first part, the history, moves agunot from subject, a category of rabbinic law, to subject across Jewish time and space, very much focusing on the behavior of women as agents, as players in their own lives against systematic disabilities and abuse. The book's second part is an assessment of the current state of Igun, focusing on the US and Israel, in which between them, 85% of Jews today live, half of them in Israel. The legal systems in both countries differ significantly. There is separation of church and state in the US, and halakha, or any religious law, has no standing under civil law, while in Israel, there is no civil marriage. Personal status, including termination of marriage, is handled by the respective religious authorities of citizens, with divorce for Jews enacted only in rabbinic courts, those of the state-recognized chief rabbinate, which is administered now and has been for years by Haredi rabbis, or in independent Haredi rabbinic courts. Many discussions center on this fundamental legal difference and on its significance for handling of Igun and Agunot. I focus on the relevant similarity, how rabbinic courts today in these two countries, but also anywhere such courts functions, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, administer divorce, because they all use the same system as it developed over the course of Jewish history, which fundamentally abuses women in the act of marriage and in divorce. The benefit of a long historical perspective is that it yields clear understanding of the nature of the problem, without which there can be no end to it. No understanding of why tactics that have been employed by Aguna advocates for well over 100 years, and yes, Aguna advocacy is nothing new, why these tactics did not work, do not work, and cannot work to end it. No less than in the case of medical diagnosis, if there is no accurate diagnosis of a social problem, there can be no effective cure for it. A comprehensive historical study yields a clear grasp of what Igun was and is in the real life of Jewish societies and the real lives of women. In particular, that it is not episodic, nor the tragedy of this or that woman, or even of women altogether, but systemic. That however personal it is in the lives of women who are victims, it is a systemic problem that has endured for millennia and persists to this day, in which all Jewish women are potential victims. The problem is not with bad husbands and bad rabbis, though both abound, but with a system. Bad husbands and bad rabbis are necessary products of that system, not its cause. Keeping the focus on the system's necessary byproducts, but not on its cause, precludes solution and ensures that the abuse continues. To keep this focus is to treat symptoms rather than cause. After the history and illustration of the continuation of Igun today and documentation of what doesn't work to end it, the third part of the book is programmatic, devoted to laying out what will finally end the abuse. First and foremost, I argue women need to know this history of Jewish women, agunot, not just as victims, but as assertive, aggressive, and transgressive actors on their own behalf throughout Jewish history. Behavior manifested for centuries across Jewish ethnicities, Middle Eastern, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, despite the fact that women could not communicate strategies and tactics to one another systematically, but continuously, generation after generation, reinvented strategies of defense and self-protection. We need to know that such behavior was entirely typical in traditional, pre-modern Jewish societies. There was nothing else. And that it had significant effects that bettered women's actual ability to protect themselves from marital and divorce abuse. Such behavior happened in traditional pre-modern communal contexts and was a normal part of traditional Jewish communities in medieval Ashkenaz, Sfarad, and the Middle East, in early modern Italy and in the Ottoman Empire, in major communities like Istanbul and Saloniki, as well as in Palestine and Mediterranean islands like Crete. The communal context for women's assertive behavior was part of what the Israeli historian Simcha Goldin calls a pre-modern communal paradigm that saw the welfare of the community and of women as inseparable, not out of compassion, much less pity, but from pragmatic communal self-interest. In this understanding, Igun was not an individual problem, a tragedy for individual women to bear, but a communal problem, which I maintain is how we need once again to see it and address it in order to end it, but in our day as a supra-communal problem of diaspora and Israeli Jews alike across all denominations and none. These components, knowing the history and learning from it, and addressing the problem as a communal one of diaspora and Israeli Jewry that can indeed be ended through concrete, effective actions, are the roadmap to finally ending this historic and ongoing abuse. In the book's third section, I propose such a supra-communal, meta-denominational initiative. So I've spoken about what isn't the source or origin of Igun. Here is what is. The source, the origin of Jewish women's captivity is the method in which rabbinic marriage is enacted. Rabbinic marriage is enacted in two legal stages, and I emphasize legal stages with binding power in rabbinic law. The first is kinyan, the groom's acquisition of authority over exclusive, legitimate access to his bride's body, her sexuality and reproductivity, moving authority over this from her father or other male guardian to the new husband, the word for which is Baal, meaning master or owner. See Birkat Erusin in the marriage ceremony. This is what the words of that blessing reference. The second legal step is Kiddushin, sanctification, from the same root as Kiddush or Kaddish, sanctifying this exclusive access by the Baal. This is done through the line we all surely know, which the groom pronounces to the bride before kosher witnesses, Harei at Mekudeshet, and so on. Kinyan and Kiddushin are unilateral acts by the groom, the new husband. He marries. The woman is married. She is entirely passive in the ceremony, but for acquiescing to it. This is the origin of Igun. Marriage being male enacted and unilateral, so is divorce. Rabbinic law elaborates on all this a great deal, insisting that the husband's free will in granting a divorce is mandatory. Women in this system can request a divorce, a get, but they can neither give one nor can they emancipate themselves. The abuses that follow from this system are necessary and inevitable. Get extortion, vindictive withholding of divorce, and women being chained in marriages even without a husband's intent. There are a number of ways a wife can become an aguna. If a husband disappears, and abandonment of wives and families was epidemic in Jewish societies of every ethnicity throughout Jewish history, Jewish families and societies were anything but stable. The wife is an aguna with no hope of release. There is no time limit to this state, including if the husband did not willfully abandon the wife, but drowned in a shipwreck or died in another accident, or died in criminal incidents or war, but where no body identifiable to elaborate Talmudic specifications was recovered, which was the typical situation. If the husband converted and did not give his wife a get, which he was empowered to do under rabbinic law, conversion having no effect on his status as a Jew, however a bad one, she became an aguna. If a husband died and had no children in the marriage, his widow was obligated to marry, and here, Francesca, you can show maybe the term list. She was obligated to marry his brother, called the lever, Levir, in levirate marriage. She is held in marital captivity, in marital reserve to her brother-in-law, not free to marry someone else, unless the lever enacts a release in a ritual called chalitza, which is also on the list. If he does not do this, the widow was not free to marry someone else. She remained, quote unquote, married to a man all acknowledged was dead. Not only get extortion and abuse, but chalitza extortion and abuse were rife throughout Jewish history. I want now to discuss what real women did in the face of these realities, giving you some examples I discuss in the book. I have typified such behavior as assertive, aggressive, and transgressive. Listen and tell me if you think these adjectives fit. I have mentioned significant reforms in the medieval era that benefited women. I should say that such reform began much earlier. The ketubah is a major such reform. The ketubah is a unilateral prenuptial agreement binding on the husband that states a husband's minimal material obligations to the wife during the marriage and in case of divorce. To any who oppose prenups now, not that prenups are any guarantee against divorce withholding or other abuse, but to any who oppose prenups, and there are such, as somehow not traditional, I suggest they familiarize themselves with the ketubah. The major, huge medieval reform that benefited women was a takana, or a rabbinic ordinance called Takanat Hamoredet, the ordinance concerning the rebellious wife. Rebellious wife is a category in halacha applied to women who do not fulfill wifely obligations as specified in the Mishnah, preparing and serving food and fulfilling other basic household duties, sex, and demands a get, her desisting from these services being a way to pressure the husband to give her a get. The Talmud states that the punishment for such a wife is withholding of the get and the diminution of her ketubah and any other financial settlements due her at the divorce by 1/12 every month for a year until their exhaustion, at which point she's welcome to her get and to exit the marriage impoverished. In 10th century Iraq, Rav Shrira Gaon was the title of the head of post-Talmudic academies, issued a takana overturning this Talmudic ruling. In it, he ordained that rebellious women demanding divorce should get the get without delay, and with full payment of their ketubah and any other settlements the husband had undertaken to pay in case of divorce. Rav Shrira states the reason for this extraordinary action on his part. He says that soon after the Muslim conquest of Iraq in the early 7th century CE and the establishment of Sharia courts in which Islamic law was adjudicated, Jewish women denied gittin started turning to such courts, either to get the Muslim authorities to press the rabbinic court about their cases, or to convert to Islam, since under Islamic religious law, a judge, a qadi, can divorce a couple. From this, Rabbi Shrira says, catastrophe ensues, meaning either non-Jewish interference in internal Jewish affairs, an ongoing wedge for Jewish Muslim authorities, or conversion, and that this necessitates the radical takana he enacted. Takanat Hamoredet was enforced. That is, it was not just legal theory on the books or advice, but action in Jewish communities across the Jewish map for over 500 years, until there was a concerted rabbinic backlash against it and the immense powers it gave women, beginning in the 12th century Ashkenaz, led by the great Tosafist Rabbeinu Tam. Let us note why the radical ruling of Rav Shrira happened. Women denied divorce, went outside the Jewish community to non-Jewish courts for leverage. Numerous scholars in recent decades have documented that, despite Talmudic and later repeated rabbinic prohibition of Jews taking disputes to non-Jewish courts, pre-modern Jews, including prominent rabbis, did this. Women seeking and being denied divorce or denied the terms they sought in divorce were disproportionately represented among these pre-modern Jews, using recourse to non-Jewish courts, in this case as a counter to women's structural disabilities under rabbinic marriage and divorce law. The same was true in Christian Europe. Jewish women seeking and denied Gittin took their cases to non-ecclesiastical Christian courts for pressure on the rabbinic courts and on the communities in which those courts functioned. So, I rank use of non-Jewish courts by such women denied Gittin as assertive, aggressive, and transgressive behavior, at least as judged by normative, that is, official rabbinic pronouncements, which forbid this. But I must say that if behavior is so widespread as to be normal, it's hard to call this transgressive. Let us jump to 16th century Tzfat, home to the major Kabbalist and halachist Rabbi Yosef Karo, author of the Shulchan Aruch, second in halachic authority only to the Talmud. You've all surely heard of Yosef Karo. Karo had a daughter-in-law who was widowed after a childless marriage, obviously to a son of Karo. That meant that she was obligated to marry another of Karo's sons, and she didn't want to. It is important to note that the family of the deceased husband has a strong financial interest in Yibum being enacted. Yibum, again, is levirate marriage. If the widow remarries into her late husband's family, then her widow's settlement and any other financial benefits that would be hers at the end of the marriage return to his family. If she gets chalitza, release from Yibum, those assets go with her. And when and if she remarries to that unrelated husband, a huge loss to the deceased husband's family, though a tremendous asset to her on the remarriage market. Another reason that women could wish not to go along with Yibum. This calculus created an incentive to Yabamim, to levers, claiming to wish to marry the widow even when they didn't, because withholding chalitza meant being able to extort for release. Either way, he and his family won, with the widow at severe disadvantage. For whatever reason, Karo's daughter-in-law did not wish to marry the Yabam, she didn't. And the Yabam insisted that he did. They wrangled for 2 years. There was no question that any woman married into Karo's family also had rabbinic lineage, meaning male kin knowledgeable about halacha. After 2 years, someone suggested to this widow that she go on a day of Torah reading, a Monday or a Thursday, to the shul of her would-be Yabam. This was Karo's son, so no question it was Karo's shul, and Karo himself was surely there, as were plenty of kosher witnesses, at least a minyan, required for a valid halachic transaction. There, she should interrupt the Torah reading, point to the would-be Yabam, and cry out, "This is the would-be Yabam, I don't want him," and spit. And again, "This is the would-be Yabam, I don't want him," and spit. 3 times. That's chalitza, and she did it. Much debate followed about whether this action alone meant that this woman had enacted chalitza, which is the man's ritual, or whether it meant that the brother-in-law now had no choice and had to give her chalitza. Rabbis in Tzfat and Jerusalem debated the case, which obviously had huge political implications. This was Karo's interests, after all. But we do know the outcome. This woman unnamed in the sources, got chalitza. I reproduce a copy of her chalitza document in my book. It was one of the thrilling moments of my research. Another case from 16th century Tzfat. 21 Jewish men are below deck in a shipwreck in the 1540s, meaning 21 wives back in Tzfat are agunot. But one of these women remarries without receiving rabbinic dispensation to do so. Wonder what she knew that made her think it was not a good idea to wait. Now, if she remarried, that means another Jew, a man, her new husband, and 2 halachic witnesses, and an officiant, also participated in this flagrant violation of rabbinic authority. 5 transgressive Jews. Her action, theirs, set off an uproar, because if she did this, what would the other 20 agunot do? Necessarily, each of them with 4 other Jews, meaning close to 100 openly transgressive Jews in this one small town. There were arguments for leniency, declaring the other agunot widows, not agunot, that is, officially free to remarry, lest there be large-scale, flagrant violation of rabbinic authority. Better that the rabbis rule leniently, but with their authority, than have their authority undermined. So in all these cases, the women were anything but good, nice girls, as we hear this phrase used. And in the second case of the woman who remarried without rabbinic permission, note, it was not good behavior, asking, waiting for permission, or waiting on permission, but proceeding on her own, autonomous transgressive behavior that not only freed her, but got rabbis to counsel broader leniency about the other cases. All this, I stress, was medieval and early modern traditional behavior. There was nothing else. There is no blaming feminists or modernity or non-Orthodox movements for it. The women who acted in these ways acted as full claimants on the Jewish system, as entitled participants. If the system did not serve them, it was self-evident to them to pursue their interests with whatever modalities were available. They did this not to rebel against Jewish tradition or the Jewish community, but in order to stay in it viably. Conversion was an option for women as much for men, and we know of some agunot who did convert because of their predicament. Women who stayed in and forced the system to meet their needs were, I say, simultaneously rebellious and pious. They were certainly anything but acquiescing, accepting their situation as ordained and inescapable, a tragedy. They were not martyrs on the altar of loyalty to rabbinic law. In fact, we find no call to them to behave as martyrs. It was self-evident that women would act assertively on their own behalf. And their actions became part of Jewish law, established, lived, traditional Jewish practice across the Jewish world, feeding into and influencing the practice of rabbinic law, halacha. In my book, I distinguish between Jewish law and rabbinic law. Some final cases. Conditional divorces were a common, indeed a ubiquitous practice in pre-modern Jewries. Before a husband set off on a long business trip, he was forced to deposit a conditional get that stated that if he did not return by a specified date, the get took effect. The woman, therefore, could not become an aguna or a woman bound to yibum, well, which is an aguna. Such conditional divorces were also written for men in childless marriages at their request when they fell severely ill and feared that they might die, and their wives would be caught in the yibum trap from which they wished to protect them, meaning from their own brothers. So well known was chalitza extortion and abuse. The condition in these gittin was that if the husband recovered by a specified date, the get was void. Or, of course, if he recovered before that, it could just be destroyed. But some women who wanted divorce, whether the husband returned from a trip or not, used the opportunity of this legal instrument to go into hiding as the termination date on the conditional divorce neared, waiting out the clock until after the date on which the divorce took effect. When such women could not be located, meaning someone or someones were colluding with them, hiding them, and the couple was not reunited, a prerequisite for the marriage to be deemed resumed under rabbinic law, rabbinic authorities were forced by their own rules to recognize the divorce as having taken effect, with the women entitled to their ketubah and other divorce settlements. Here is how one such case is described. Here's my book. 16th century woman from Damascus who waited out the term of her conditional divorce, given not because her husband was traveling, but because of severe marital breakdown. If he did not succeed in placating her within 30 consecutive days, it would take effect. She declared, "The get is a kosher get. It was conditional on my being reconciled and reunited with my husband, but I did not reunite with him because I did not wish to reconcile, and I hid in order to flee the marriage. I have received my get. Now give me my ketubah," the monetary divorce settlement. In one case from Jerusalem, rabbis even colluded with a woman known to be abused in her marriage to extract the conditional get from her husband, knowing she would use it to escape the marriage. Such behavior was common. Rabbi David ben Zimra, the Radbaz, said, calling it quote, an everyday occurrence, unquote, and the means by which women attain, quote, the privilege to be freed from their husbands. Another woman from Istanbul, fearing rightly that a slew of failings and offenses by her husband that met technical grounds for court-mandated divorce would not deliver one, announced her intention to move to the land of Israel, which she clearly knew was even stronger grounds for court-enforced divorce when the husband refused to move there. The rabbinic decisor was consistently unsympathetic to this woman, and we don't know if her request for divorce succeeded. We certainly know that she tried. I would like to conclude this presentation by talking about the image I chose for the book's cover. So Francesca, if you can show that. I argue in my book that language uses perpetual use of the term the poor agunot, when no one would say the poor Jews about men, and tragedy, as I've discussed, but also visual image, play an unrecognized but powerful role in normalizing Jewish marital captivity and thereby perpetuating it. So, Google the word agunot or igun, and you are sure, 100% sure, to see images of chains, balls and chains, and sorrowful, defeated women. One of the things I insisted on with my wonderful editor at NYU Press, Jennifer Hammer, was that I would tolerate no image of women in chains or even of broken glass reference to the wedding ceremony in the book, never mind on its cover. Instead, I chose this image by the 19th century German Jewish painter Anselm Feuerbach, entitled Miriam, as the perfect image that conveyed a central message of my book. In it, Miriam is not a lithe young woman, nor is she classically beautiful. She has heft on her. She is not celebrating wildly. Obviously, the visual reference in the painting is to the successful exodus of the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. That abuse was in immediate memory, but she is upright. She has the celebratory timbrel in her hands per the verse in Exodus. She is looking behind at the past, aware of the past, but her gait is resolutely forward. We need to start revisioning the millennia-old problem of women's marital captivity as solvable, endable, because it is. The route to that happening is first, women knowing the full and accurate score about the source of igun and adopting good Jewish alternatives for Jewish marriage, which certainly exist, based on other categories of rabbinic law, which are mutual and reciprocal and entail no acquisition and no mastery and no control over the marital partner. The root to ending Igun is knowing its history, how Igun has functioned and developed and grown worse, in understanding that Igun is not a personal event that happens to befall the unlucky, but systemic, in which women as a class are vulnerable. I can explain why that is the case for women who are not Orthodox and do not live in Israel. No woman individually can end this abuse, nor can women on their own do so. That will happen only in the context of concerted, organized, aguna-centered, consumer-oriented, independent, communal effort across diaspora Israel lines to disseminate full and accurate information, tell the truth, and to provide the necessary support, legal, psychological, financial, occupational, residential, to enable women to exit marital captivity and not enter it in the first place, while continuing to live Jewish lives however they choose to do this, including in Orthodoxy. Not writing this off as someone else's problem, Orthodox, Israeli, but owning it as a Jewish problem to which good Jewish solutions can be applied. That is how to finally end the abuse and take out the temple.
Thank you. Thank you, Shulamit. Thank you for this rich talk and thought-provoking. While we wait for questions, so please, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, or post it on the chat, which is now open to everyone. I do have a question myself, and one thing that I've noticed is that in the past few years there has been an interest, right? There has been kind of a growth in scholarly publications, in historical publications on the question of agunot. I'm thinking of the book by Chaim Sperber on the history of agunot in Eastern Europe, a recently translated book by Noah Shashar on Ashkenazi lands in the early modern period. And I wonder if something is moving. So there is such an interest in the issue, and now your book is providing, right, this first global social history of Igun and responses to it. Can you give us a sense of the context, right? Is something moving in Israeli and Jewish society that has spurred this particular focus on the issue? I mean, I can, obviously the past 2 years have had a really important, impact, but even before October 7th.
Thanks so much for this question. I want to call out Noah Shashar and her really epic-making book that came out a few years ago, first in Hebrew and then now in English translation. Noah's book is the first book to truly historicize this problem and to apply all the methodologies that I outlined to it. Her focus is on Ashkenaz, the tremendous geographic and cultural terrain between Eastern France and Ukraine for 200 years, between 1648 and 1850. And I can't say enough about how path-breaking her work was. Noah and I are friends. By the time she was working, she had already finished her dissertation in that book and gave it to me to read. I was working on mine, so I can't say that there was influence. So I don't know. I think now, I mean, certainly my intention, my dear hope is that the publication of my book will indeed spur a lot of monographs, specialized research, because it's the first work of this kind, and there's so much unexplored terrain. And, I hope that people read it and find something wrong with it, someplace where I totally misspoke, where I totally misinterpreted, where I gave the wrong dating or the wrong, great, do it. I hope tons of doctoral dissertations and other things come from it. And I hope, I mean, my book is now published, and I hope it gets reviewed and spoken about, and then I hope very much it does set that off. I'm not sure, you know, you'd have to ask Noah what set her off. And yes, Chaim Sperber has documented meticulously. It's this very, you know, data heavy, data rich material, just documenting the names, the numbers, the places. Mind you, he looks at deserted women. He doesn't look at all the other kinds, other causes of agunot, but he does document deserted women in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century and 20th century.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Oh, I'm going to jump in. Susan Aronoff here. Hi, Shulamit.
Hey, Susan.
Here's my question. As you're talking, I think about civil disobedience, a model of civil disobedience. Have you thought about, or what do you think about trying to begin with non-Orthodox women who might be more open to very well publicized domestic partnership agreements with drafted by lawyers, since there is no way to get married in Israel without the rabbinate for a Jewish woman, but to create this wave of what you described in that case, where the rabbis are losing their authority because large numbers of people, or well, I don't think it'll be large to begin with, but a wave of people just walking away and getting married in defiance of the rabbis.
Well, I agree with your last point, definitely. I don't think that, I'm not sure what you mean by civil disobedience. You mean like demonstrations or protests?
No. I mean the marriage
or something?
itself, the marriage itself as a very public expression of walking away from the law.
Oh, it's happening already. And it's not true that you can't get married in Israel without the rabbanut. It's being done all the time. First of all, there's something called, there is Yiduim Batzibur, which is arranged by lawyers, and it basically establishes like common law marriage, and it is legal. It has to be established by, done by lawyers, but it's done. And we have a number of Israeli institutions that give information about this and support for it, including Uri Regev's Chidush. It's done, and that is definitely, the way to go. And it doesn't preclude that such people can't do some form of a Jewish marriage as well.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I say in the book, and it's really important to stress, is that no matter how you get married or where you get married, you can get married in Cyprus, you can get married in, it doesn't matter, or how. You can get married in Israel, a Reform rabbi on the beach, or a conservative rabbi on, doesn't matter. If you register the marriage with the Ministry of Interior and you're officially married, doesn't matter how, in legal status, if you want to get divorced, you're in a rabbinic court, and most people don't realize that. But
Right.
These groups that propagate Yiduim Batzibur make that clear, and they walk couples through how to do it, so that the termination of a marriage is like the termination of any other contract agreement. And matters such as custody of children or property, or, all of that are handled in extensive prenuptial agreements, which, by the way, was a total and absolute norm in Jewish pre-modernity. Now it's being treated like this, hallelujah, this great new, invention of the last few decades nonsense. This was the Jewish norm for all of Jewish history, that there were extensive prenuptial agreements because marriage was an economic institution. Everybody understood that, and everybody's interests had to be protected. They needed to be laid out and negotiated. So that's what's done. You can do it in Israel, and it is being done. And it's being done increasingly. The news of this is getting out. And what we need to do is support the organizations that get the news out. And they do. They have webinars.
Great.
But yes, I mean,
I'll just
in short,
mention it. about 20 years ago, when the Sephardic rabbi was Bakshi Doron, he publicly said that if the rabbis don't loosen up on this, people are going to start walking away, and said we're better off for finding we must find a solution or people are going to walk away. Yeah.
Good, good.
So congratulations on your fabulous book.
Thank you, Susan.
Okay.
Susan is a good friend of many decades and a absolutely heroic Aguna advocate and pioneer in doing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from Natan Meir.
Hi, Natan.
Hi,
Good
Shulamit.
name.
Mazal tov.
Hi.
I want to, with your permission, I want to take a step slightly away from the content and focus on the meta of the book for a second. And I wanted to ask you, what was it like to combine scholarship and activism in a book that's published by a university press? I wondered if you had any hesitations about doing it, or if you have any suggestions for others who are considering doing that kind of thing, because it's still unconventional.
Yeah, well, that's the wonder of having left my position. You know, frankly, I think that even had I stayed as a full professor, I could do whatever I wanted. But, you know, doing this book does nothing for me professionally because I'm a Marital already. You know, I get no benefit and, you know, nobody can complain. What is this? It's not pure scholarship, yada, yada. I was very cognizant of that. And I was a little concerned about convincing an academic press to publish it because it is also open advocacy. I mean, I make very clear when I'm doing one or the other, but it's both. And I've got to say that I was enormously fortunate in NYU Press and in Jennifer Hammer as an editor. I never had to make that case. You know, I think in terms, you know, a history of slavery, for instance, who would think, that there wouldn't be one, which was the case here. I went crazy. When I started this, I'm looking for like, there has to be stuff. And Bemet, there was nothing, not even articles. I still can't get my head around that. No encyclopedia, no articles. Never mind, no books, no monographs, nothing. Try to imagine if the institution of slavery didn't have a history. You know, so the person who would write it obviously would be engaged about it and would write from a perspective of, I've got to reveal this. I've got to talk about it. I've got to show what went on. I've got to, right? Nobody would question that there was advocacy in it. And frankly, as I say in the preface, the introduction to my book, you know this, God knows you write books. Nobody gets up in the morning and writes a book. It's years of work and pain and suffering and sleepless nights and, you know, stress and tension and deadlines and cursing yourself for doing it, right? You do it because you're motivated, because there's something driving you, and it's not just getting a job or keeping one, though not to slight those. But we're driven by something, and that's not something bad. That's something good. That's what, you know, bias in this sense give a driving motivation for the book. Bias is a good thing. What you need to do is to be transparent about it, to be open, to own it, to say, and then you go ahead and do it. And you got footnotes. And if somebody, bavakasha in my case, if you find something wrong with what I've done, please go right ahead. But no, I had no, for me, they were intertwined. And not only that, but I mean, I think some of the people on this know my mother was an Aguna. I mean, you can't belabor that. It has stamped my whole life. So I'm the daughter of an Aguna. It has stamped my life. It has traumatized my life. I will never be free of that experience. But I'm also a highly trained historian, and I know how to do this work. And I'm motivated to do it. And I don't know of too many other people who could have done it. And so, absolutely, it was my mandate and my duty to do it. And, you know, it's miserable stuff, but I'm glad to have done it. And I'm very, very glad for the support of people who have supported it all the way, my research and the long trip that it took, and many, the miseries and also the shocks of the things I was discovering, and how crazy it made me. Every time I thought I had reached rock bottom, it can't get worse. It always did. Just surprise, it always got worse. And the people who believed in the merit of what I was doing and supported it. So, I am grateful and glad for all of that. I'm glad it's out.
We're grateful to you for pushing through to the end.
Thank you.
There is a question by Amy Schiff in the chat. She asks, your book is a true call to action within the Jewish world. What is your idea about how to actually begin changing Jewish marital practices, not only for the secular Jew? Is it supposed to be a movement across Jewish life?
I don't think that there will be one right approach to this, nor should there be, at least not in the foreseeable future. I think we need to open this wide open once women in particular really understand what rabbinic marriage is. And even in other movements, the conservative movement does kinyan and kiddushin. They deal with the after effects of that in other ways. In completely non-traditional marriages, you hear kinyan and kiddushin being done. You hear harayat mekudeshet, right? People don't understand what they're doing in the moment. I didn't say this in my talk, but I will now. Those two legal enactments, kinyan and kiddushin, not only are the basis for future igun, they are inherently degrading and dehumanizing to women in the moment. They are commodify women. They transact women's bodies. There is nothing beautiful about it. I don't care how many flowers or how much music is around when it's done. I don't think women know that, not in Orthodoxy and not outside of it, not when that term is used. What I do think, Amy, and would love to see, and I talk about it in that part of the book, is for Jews across denominations and no denominations. I don't particularly have a denomination. I'm a very committed Jew, and I don't subscribe to any of them. Israeli diaspora, to have an open discourse about this, to study the sources that, for instance, Rabbi Rachel Adler used when she developed an alternative marriage ritual that is based on rabbinic partnership law. So it's based on rabbinic law, but it comes at it from a different basis. We have another proposal that uses the laws, the practices of neder and hatarat nedarim to establish, a vow, which in rabbinic practice is not just a declaration of intent, but it's legally binding. So a neder to establish, hatarat nidarim, which is what kol nidre is, to annul vows when the couple or one party to it wishes to annul the partnership. There are ways to do this, and by engaging that conversation, we deepen our connection with Jewish sources and Jewish texts and our own Jewish identities and commitments. So saying no to igun and to the way that rabbinic marriage is traditionally enacted is not walking away from Jewish tradition and Jewish practice. It's reinventing it, it's revitalizing it, it's recreating it. And that's, yes, I would like to see that happen across movements and with people with no movement affiliation. I would like to see it happen among Israeli Jews and between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews. And I suggest in the book, the Chavura movement, Hadar, Limud, right? Online forums like this, there are ways to do that. And we can make materials available to people to study in Chavruta, to study in groups, in order to develop new good ways that are based on solid information. I think it would also be a mitzvah for Jews across denominations and across geographic lines to have this conversation with one another, a Jewish conversation.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Has the Israeli public opinion been active on the question, within the past 2 years as a result of the October 7th event? As the idea, the fact that husbands were taken away, wives were waiting at home. Has this been in the public discourse more?
Yes, for sure. For sure, because if men's bodies are not recovered and the women are married, they're going to not just recovered, but identified according
Right.
to elaborate Talmudic
Yeah.
specifications. So yes, it was. I mean, in most cases, not entirely. I'm still wearing my hostage pin because it's not over yet. We don't have all the bodies back.
And so has this situation, the specific situation that came about, has it triggered any sort of, collective reckoning with the issue of Igun? Or is it simply, we have this problem and we just deal with the problem as bodies get recovered? Is there a philosophical conversation going on in Israel about the issue or not?
The question is not philosophical. If a woman is in a situation where her husband has been in the war and has not returned and his body is not recovered, this is not a philosophical question. I don't know of a movement about this. I mean, this is a very traumatized society and we're far from out of it. So I haven't heard that. I suspect that it's more the latter part of what you said, that any woman in this situation is dealing with it individually, which is exactly what should not happen. Because the problem I keep saying is however it falls individually on women is systemic and not individual, and the only end of it will be when it's recognized and treated as systemic and not put on individual women.
Do we have any other questions?
I want to call out Carol Birkin. I love who I see. Carol Birkin was my first history professor. And at a point where I never imagined such a thing, she told me that I was really smart, which I never thought of myself as being, and really good at history.
I ordered you. I ordered you to be a
I was afraid to
historian.
come to your class if I didn't do what you said. Ordered me to apply to Barnard and go to, I kept trying to convince not a candidate for Barnard. They never accept me. But thanks to Carol. Voila.
I'm
Good to
very
see you.
proud of you.
Oh, love you.
I love you too, dear.
Oh.
There's a question by Robert Shapiro in the chat. He's asking if you've ever used Haim. Is it grade or grade?
Grade.
Chaim Grade's Diaguna in teaching.
I do, absolutely. I mention it. I mean, I have a section where I talk about how the Aguna problem entered Jewish public space in newspapers and literature. Very important development in the history of all this. And Chaim Grade wrote a novel called The Aguna. And I do mention it, and I talk about the plot that he describes there. Chaim Grade, unlike I.B. Singer, loved women. And he was extremely sympathetic to women, and his portraits of women, his portraiture altogether is unbelievably brilliant. But he wrote this whole novel, and what's important in it that I particularly use and reference, the Aguna in Grade's novel has been an Aguna for something like 15 years after her husband did not return from World War I when his whole unit was wiped out. So that's classic Aguna stuff. The whole unit is wiped out. What are the odds that he's alive? None, but they haven't recovered an identified body, and she's an Aguna. She keeps Grada keeps saying about her, she keeps saying she's not religious, she's not religious, she's not religious, but it is inconceivable to her when a would-be suitor shows up that she would not get rabbinic dispensation to remarry. This is very important because many women whom I call tradition friendly, and in Israel, this is the majority of women who are not Orthodox. They're not consistently halachically obedient, halachically compliant, but they're traditional. Will say, I'm not religious. But when they get married, they want the rabbi to do what they know and what they've seen. And when they get divorced, they find themselves in rabbinic courts. And I make a strong argument for respecting that, respecting the beliefs and the traditions of women, whatever they are. And I use the Aguna in Grada's novel as a perfect example of what tradition friendly means. Grada's novel is set in Vilna, where the secular culture, including what Grada came into, was pervaded by rabbinic categories and terms and understandings and values and norms. And the same is true in Israeli society. So yes, I do use it.
Thank you.
We still have a few minutes for questions. So if there's any final questions or comments.
I'm looking for.
If not, then we can end this meeting. Thank you so much, Professor Magnus, for the talk and presenting your book. The book is out now with NYU Press, so go get your copy. Actually, why don't I do that? Let me put a link to the press page, which I have right here. There's an ebook available. Here you can find the information. So thank you again. Thank you all for coming and enjoy.
Thank you for this opportunity and great questions. Thanks.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Let's hope the rest of the dead hostages are recovered and returned. Laila Tov, Laila Shaket.
Be well.
Bye. Be well. Take care.